Good afternoon and welcome to this special conversation with Broadway Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. I am Ryan Price, Senior Pastor here at Broadway. Broadway seeks to encourage dialogue and action around the most critical issues facing our communities and country. And we are so glad to welcome today Dr. David Gushee to discuss with us his book, After Evangelicalism, The Path to a New Christianity. This conversation is a kickoff to a 4-week study of Dr. Gushee's book and an introduction to many of the themes found in its pages. Dr. Gushee is a much sought after theologian and thought leader, and we are delighted to have him join us today. Note that a follow-up conversation has been scheduled with Dr. Gushee for Sunday, October 24th at this same time in the afternoon. In a moment, Mark Peterson, the chair of Broadway's Adult Ministries Committee, will more formally introduce Dr. Gushee. But before he does, it is important that I also thank you for your attendance and participation today. We are glad you are here also, and we welcome your comments via chat. Our online host, Jen Nelson, will be monitoring our platforms and passing along questions and comments to me and to Dr. Gushee. There will also be an open floor time for conversation near the end of today's discussion. Again, we are glad you are here. Please note this conversation will be curated along with many others on our broadwaybc.org website. We encourage you to check that out. Now then, without further ado, Mark Peterson.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks all who have joined us today. We are very excited about the opportunity, first to obviously do a book study on Dr. Gushee's book, After Evangelicalism, but more importantly is the fact that we can have the author introduce this book to us and his journey as he has made to follow up evangelicalism in his own life. Dr. Gushee is an ethicist, a pastor, an author, and an advocate. He's a distinguished university professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University and the chair of Christian social ethics at what I would call the Free University in Amsterdam. Gushee is the elected past president of both the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Christian Ethics, signaling his role as one of the world's leading Christian scholars. He's an author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of more than 25 books and over 175 academic book chapters. His most recognized works include Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust, Kingdom Ethics, The Sacredness of Human Life, and Changing Our Mind. So we're excited about the opportunity to look into his new book, After Evangelicalism, as it charts a theological and ethical course for post-evangelical Christians, a course he more personally relates in his other book, a memoir called Still Christian. Over a 28-year career, he's been a devoted teacher and mentor as Professor Gushee to college students, seminarians, and PhD students. He's also led significant activist efforts on climate, torture, and LGBTQ inclusion, and continues to be a keynote speaker at churches, forums, and universities. David and his wife, Jenny, live in Atlanta, where they are happily surrounded by 3 children and 2 grandchildren. He's a classic novel reader, a world traveler, which he hopes to continue in the near future, and a tennis player. He says that he awaits a call from his beloved Atlanta Braves to resume the baseball career he abandoned in college. And I also learned through our own Dan Stiver that he was quite a basketball player too. So with that, David, thank you for joining us to introduce your book, and we look forward to your words to us today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ryan. And thanks to all of you. I have some friends on this Zoom call. I'm seeing Dan Stiver in the middle of my screen. In 1984, he was a 14-year-old professor, and I was a 10-year-old student at Southern Baptist Seminary. That that'll help you get the ages dated properly. So anyway, it's good to see the Stivers. It's good to see the Beans, and I see Terry Hamrick, and I'm not even seeing. I only have one screen up. So anyway, great to see everybody, and thank you for the honor of spending some of your weekends and weeks studying my book. I have an introduction that kind of goes like this. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the book, and then I'm going to step back and link it to my own story. And then if there's time, I'm going to go a little more deeply into the content of the book, so you can have at least some heads up from me as to what I think is most important in terms of the flow of the argument. The book we're talking about is this one here. It's called After Evangelicalism. It has a maze on the cover at my request, and hopefully you'll understand why there's a maze on the cover before too long. The subtitle is The Path to a New Christianity, which is not exactly what I'm attempting to do. I don't think anybody invents a new Christianity after 2,000 years, but it is a signal of the fact that the book is my best effort to talk about a version of Christianity that might make sense for people who have been in and then out of American evangelical Christianity. So, and how that relates to the Baptist, Southern Baptist, ex-Southern Baptist, moderate Baptist, Texas Baptist world, CBF Baptist, I'll say a little bit about perhaps just for this audience. And that's a kind of a different conversation, but it is related. So let me get out my notes here. So this book is a pastoral and scholarly effort to critique what I and many others believe has gone wrong with white or white-dominated American evangelical Protestant Christianity, which I'll shorthand as evangelicalism, and to provide a methodological, theological, and moral path out of that religious subculture to something that is post-evangelical, but not post-Christian. There's a lot of footnote here. There's a lot of post-Christian, spiritual, but not religious, spiritual exile type literature and kind of community stuff happening online. That's not what I'm doing. I want people to remain committed to Christ, but on the other side of evangelicalism is who I'm speaking to. So just as a working definition, for now, I'll define white American evangelical Protestant Christianity or evangelicalism this way. Until recently, the numerically largest Protestant religious identity or community in the United States, a trans-denominational, intentionally created Protestant Christian subculture emerging from pre-World War II fundamentalism, grouping together various theologically, morally, and politically conservative white Christians. And for this largely Baptist audience, a way to situate it is evangelicalism is bigger, far bigger than the Southern Baptist Convention. But the Southern Baptist Convention, part of what happened in the conservative resurgence or takeover is that Southern Baptists the leaders of the new Southern Baptist Convention decided to align themselves with this older evangelical movement or identity. And so part of what we lived through, who went through that, was that process. So that definition again, evangelicalism or white American evangelicalism, until recently the numerically largest Protestant religious identity and community in the United States, a trans-denominational, intentionally created Protestant Christian subculture emerging from pre-World War II fundamentalism, grouping together various theologically, morally, and politically conservative white Christians. Somebody needs to mute. Is that you, Mark? Jen, mute that out of control Mark Peterson fellow, will you? All right, there we go. All right. So, so my book is pastoral and scholarly, I said. So let me say what I mean by that. It's pastoral, that is, it's ministerial. It's rooted in my calling as a Christian minister, as a Baptist minister. in 1984, when I sat in Dan Stiver's Formation for Christian Ministry class, I was on a path to become a minister of the gospel, and I still am that person. I was ordained in 1987. So that's 34 years, and I have not given up that identity. So I'm a minister. As a minister, I try to advance the Christian faith and to care for the souls of those who are in the church. Also, as a minister, I still believe my responsibility is to try to present an attractive vision of the Christian faith for those on the outside of the church. As many as 25 million American Christians have left evangelicalism behind, and there's been tremendous acceleration of that trend in the last 5 years, especially among the young, and I see it in my classrooms. 40% of those who have left are no longer affiliated with Christianity at all. Now, leaving a religious community is difficult. By all accounts, leaving evangelical Christianity has been very, very difficult for millions of people. In some cases, it has been precipitated by and accompanied by trauma and a sense of alienation from God. So as a pastor, my purpose in writing this book is to care for those who are in this often traumatized post-evangelical place, and to help them find a way to return to or remain in a relationship with Jesus on a post-evangelical basis. Basically, when you have been exiled or feel the need to leave your religious community, as many of us in this group know, it is traumatizing, and it can often lead to a blanket sense that I can no longer be a Christian, I can no longer be a part of the church. So this book is for those who are maybe or have been in that space, and to say you can still be a follower of Jesus. Hopefully you can still find the church just on the other side of evangelicalism. The book is also scholarly in that I'm using various academic tools, first of all, history and sociology, to better understand and analyze the development of what can be described as a religious subculture that ended up having the name evangelical Christianity. So part of the early part of the book especially attempts to understand what the subculture is and how it developed. But then after that, I use the constructive tools of theology, scripture, tradition, experience, and also the constructive tools of Christian ethics, which is my main discipline, to try to offer a fresh presentation of what to believe theologically and biblically, of how to live, of how to affiliate on the other side of evangelicalism. So the book is organized into 9 chapters. That's 3 parts of 3 chapters each. So after an intro, the book takes on these subjects. In the first third, chapter 1 is called Evangelicalism, Cutting Loose from an Invented Community. The basic thesis here is that evangelicalism, sometimes pronounced evangelicalism, not evangelism, that's telling people about Jesus. This is evangelicalism, or community. That evangelicalism is an invented identity, a term picked by 1940s era fundamentalists like Carl Henry and some older than him, to relabel a group of fundamentalists, to rebrand as evangelical, and to create a trans-denominational religious community around this rebranded identity, to be an alternative to both fundamentalism and mainline Protestantism. And this now 80-year-old effort ended up becoming fabulously successful in accomplishing what they hoped to accomplish: institution building, subculture creating, and claiming space in the American evangelical or American religious landscape and even political landscape. So I would say one sign of the success of this movement is that Southern Baptists, who proudly nurtured a regional identity and a denominational identity for over 100 years, gradually decided to adopt the evangelical label after the 1990s. Well, I can say more about that a bit. And then chapter 2 is on scripture, subtitle From Inerrancy to the Church's Book. And my basic claim there is that part of what has been understood to be required to be an evangelical or fundamentalist Christian is to believe in inerrant scripture. I argue how that has become, well, it was never quite how scripture should have been described, and it has become a stumbling block to many people and helped to drive them out of Christianity. And so I propose a different way of understanding what the Bible is. Chapter 3 is called Resources, Hearing God's Voice Beyond Scripture. And here my basic claim is that the evangelical emphasis on the inerrancy, infallibility, truthfulness, authority of the Bible also was accompanied by a tendency to denigrate the value of other sources for knowing anything, including reason, experience, science, the liberal arts, the other religious traditions, or anything else in the world outside of the Bible as it was interpreted. And this unnecessarily cramped and limited how fundamentalists and evangelicals came to understand the world. And so I'm proposing that be reconsidered. In the second part of the book, I talk about God, Jesus, and church. So chapter 4, called God in Dialogue with the Story of Israel, essentially is a revisiting of the Hebrew Bible and my account of what to make of the Hebrew Bible and what can be carried forward constructively into a post-evangelical space. Chapter 5 on Jesus, the subtitle there is Apocalyptic Prophet, Lynched God-Man, and Risen Lord. And so there I offer an account of Jesus that I think addresses some of evangelicalism's weaknesses. Chapter 6, called Church, Finding Christ's People, is a reconceptualizing of what church is, and especially it's maybe a guidepost to post-evangelicals as to where they might look to find Christian community, given that most of them have lost the community in which they were raised. The last third of the book moves to the ethics. Chapter 7 is called Sex, From Sexual Purity to Covenant Realism. And one of the things that is at the center of exodus from evangelicalism is how sexuality has been handled in evangelical churches. And I address two main issues. One is the exclusion of LGBTQ people. The other is purity culture, in which a great deal of shame is loaded on people, especially women, related to sexuality. And so I attempt a covenantal sexual ethics on the other side of that. Chapter 8 on politics is subtitled Starting Over After White Evangelicalism's Embrace of Trumpism. Now we get into politics. I don't know how y'all feel about that, but you'll read it and see what you think. But my basic claim here is, well, it's clear empirically that white evangelicalism's embrace of Trump, both in 2016 and in 2020 until today, has been discrediting for many, many young people who don't understand it. And so that, in general, what I do in that chapter is to try to take us back to the sources of a healthy political ethic, which is an important part of Christian theological and ethical tradition. Finally, the last chapter, Race, is called Unveiling and Ending White Supremacist Christianity. And in recent years in my career, it has become clearer to me that this ubiquitous and permanent problem of racism in America and in American Christianity is all tangled up with what has happened with evangelicalism. And it's a bigger than evangelical project, but it is certainly a major project of our time to name what went wrong there and to get on the other side of white supremacist Christianity. So, and then the last, I have an epilogue, and then I have a kind of an appendix that lists 9 different types of post-evangelical Christians, because they're not all the same. So that is what's in the book. In the end, I say this, and here's the maze. A bit about the maze. the image that came to mind for me as I was beginning to write this book, and also as I was pastorally talking with a lot of 20 and 30 something ex-evangelicals, is that evangelicalism, which was supposed to provide a clear path to Jesus, had become a place where people got stuck, like in a maze where you can't get out. And so maybe sometime in high school they were told that they had to believe in an inerrant Bible, or maybe in college they were told that you could believe in evolution or Jesus, but not both. Or maybe they were shamed for coming out as gay, or maybe they were looked on with contempt because they didn't vote a certain way, and so they got lost in the maze. And so I say this. This is how I end the book. Many millions of young people got lost back in that evangelical maze. They couldn't get past inerrancy, indifference to the environment, purity culture, divine violence, rejection of gay people, male dominance, racism, the idea that God is a Republican, or whatever else. If I help to provide a way out of this place and a way ahead in the direction of Jesus, then all I can say is thanks be to God. The book has been out now about 14 months, 13 months, and it has really gone around the world. It's sold well, and I'm hearing a lot of good feedback from a lot of people. I really think, I'm grateful to say, I think it is speaking to people just as I hoped that it would. And again, I feel honored that you're wanting to study it. So now let me tell you a little bit more about the backstory of the author who wrote it, and then we'll see how our time is looking. I might just go into Q&A at that point and not give you all the great things that are in the book, and so you don't feel the need to be in the group, right? So, but anyway, here's my story. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, raised in Vienna, Virginia, in the 1960s. My mother was Catholic, and she was the prime religious influence in our family. My dad was kind of a lapsed Baptist. I was a rebellious teenager, so I told my mom I was not going to go to Catholic church anymore after confirmation. And at 16, I wandered into a Southern Baptist church on a Friday afternoon because a girl I was dating was a member there. She didn't get me there, but I went on my own one afternoon. 3 days later, I had prayed the sinner's prayer, and I was a converted Southern Baptist. And that weekend, what happened that weekend and how that happened is one of the most pivotal, certainly the most pivotal spiritual experience of my young life. So at 16 years old, I was a freshly baptized Southern Baptist convert, raised Catholic, and I had to learn how to, also from northern roots. My mother was from Western Pennsylvania, my dad was from Boston. So Dr. Stiver, you may remember this, that my spiritual autobiography paper for you in 1984 was called this: What's a nice Northern Roman Catholic boy like me doing in a place like this, at Southern Baptist Seminary? And I was trying to wrestle with identity questions. So from my age 16 to going off to college, and then after, I was learning the Southern Baptist subculture and learning how to be a disciple of Christ as I was taught it in that subculture. And that church was really conservative, but with eclectic influences. I was given W.A. Criswell, Why I Believe the Bible is Literally True. I was given the late great Planet Earth to read, King James Version Bible, the Living Bible, and some C.S. Lewis. And that was how I got started on my Christian journey. But I was also given about 10 hours a week in church, Sunday school, training union, youth choir, Wednesday night, RAs. And they were pretty serious about discipling me as a devout Southern Baptist. You're supposed to live a morally pure life, tell everybody about Jesus, be committed to missions, be in the church every time the doors are open. And they taught me that, and they discipled me into that, and that was what I learned. Went to Southern Seminary after William and Mary, and it was the mid 80s. The denominational takeover was in full swing. Southern Seminary was aware that it was coming, but I got a good education there. One of the things that happened was I discovered Christian ethics as a discipline with Paul Simmons and Glenn Stassen. And I knew that that was what I was supposed to do. I love that discipline, still do. Christian social ethics, as I was taught it there, is about how to bring the deepest truths of Christian faith into contact with the world as it really is. And that deep social ethics tradition that went back several generations at Southern helped to shape me. So in 1987, when I was done, I decided to go to Union Seminary in New York, study with a Lutheran ethicist named Larry Rasmussen. And it was the late 80s. The Cold War was just at the end of I was going to write about nuclear weapons, but then the Soviet Union collapsed. And I ended up writing about Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. And that study became very formative for me, because one of the things I learned was that just because people carry the name Christian doesn't mean they do anything good for anybody else, but they might, depending on who they have become, how they have been formed, and how they respond to the challenges that are placed in front of them. And righteous Gentiles, which is the Jewish term for rescuers in that context, they risked everything to save Jews. And in that dissertation, which was published in 1994, I concluded that we needed to try to be about producing more courageous, compassionate, countercultural Christians like that. And so that was what my career was going to be about. During that time in New York, eventually I took a job in Philadelphia with a man named Ron Sider. Ron Sider was the author of Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, which was a major book of the 70s. He was a Mennonite, a Canadian, a pacifist, and a loyal evangelical. And Ron Sider and I had many, many, many talks about my religious identity, because by the early 90s, I was pretty confused. I wasn't sure I was really going to be a Southern Baptist, especially with what was beginning to happen. Union was really liberal. The main groups were described as liberals and radicals, and I wasn't sure I was either one of those. Ron said, I think you ought to consider thinking of yourself as an evangelical. Not a Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson evangelical, but a, peace and justice evangelical. A Jim Wallace, Tony Campolo, maybe Ron Sider evangelical. And that is who I ended up connecting with, those individuals, as well as that part of the evangelical community. So for those of you who don't know that background, for me, that's how I ended up embracing the identity evangelical, because of Ron Sider and because of the kinds of evangelicals that he had around him. Devoutly Christian, love the scripture, love Jesus, love their neighbor. And this led to commitments in the world that aligned with my understanding of Christian ethics. So by 93, I was done with my dissertation. I'd worked with Ron for 3 years. I was looking for work, and the only place I could get a job was, yes, back at Southern Baptist Seminary. I was in the last group hired before a man named Al Mohler became president at Southern Baptist Seminary. And so in 1993, I went back to Southern and found a school that was rapidly moving to the right. And I lasted 3 years. I was in the group that was told that a position that had once been acceptable and preferred was now no longer acceptable. If you supported women as pastors, you could not remain or be advanced at Southern. And I saw a lot of people compromise to be able to keep their jobs, but I wasn't able or willing to do that. And so in 1996, in the spring, I left and I went to Union University in West Tennessee. David Dockery was the provost at Southern. He got the job at Union and he took me over there. And I was there for 11 years. at Union, I was more progressive minded than most anyone, certainly in the religion department, but I had the president's support. He had hired me. And I over that decade or so, I was making significant strides in my scholarship and in my public work. I was speaking in the evangelical subculture. I was a columnist for Christianity Today magazine. Wherever ethics was being discussed, I had a spot in the room, and I was pretty young, 40, even a little younger when I started. I was there beginning at the age of 34. So I settled in that niche of kind of center left evangelical ethicist. But this space began to close up on me. In 2006 and 2007, from a pretty now well-known place, I took stands on climate change and on torture. Climate change, I wrote a document called the Evangelical Climate Initiative. And on torture, I wrote an essay for Christianity Today called 5 Reasons Why Torture is Always Wrong. It was when the Bush administration started torturing people after 9/11. Neither of these documents, which were nationally recognized, were popular with our 95% conservative Republican constituency. The tensions were real with the president for me at this point. I didn't know what the future was going to hold, but then Bill Underwood of Mercer University asked me to come his way. And so I moved to Mercer in Atlanta in 2007 at the age of 45. So then by this point, I still identified as a center-left evangelical, but I was seeing that white American evangelicalism was hardening. It was narrowing. That what was happening in the Southern Baptist Convention was also happening in the broader evangelical world, that space for people like me was closing rapidly. The presidency of Barack Obama had something to do with it. White evangelicals in general became more reactionary and more hostile. But anyway, I was still able to hold on until in 2014, I wrote this book called Changing Our Mind. And it began as a series of articles in Baptist News Global. It was just an effort on my part to think through the LGBTQ question from the ground up, as if I didn't have to be afraid of losing my job, because I didn't. And by 2014, the sense that the traditional teaching about gay people was harmful, was not ironclad, not as airtight as people thought it was, and that it needed to be reconsidered, was everywhere. But a lot of people who would have wanted to reconsider it didn't have the space to do it. They could lose their jobs. They didn't have tenure, whatever. So I wrote this book, and it became notorious. It came out in the fall of 2014. And this is what finally earned me the rejection of mainstream evangelicalism. Book contracts canceled, speaking appearances canceled, friendships broken, social media attacks, and every message possible sent to me that I had left the team. I was no longer an evangelical Christian. So I had become a symbol at this point. Very important to LGBTQ Christians and ex-Christians, but very much a problem for those who did not believe that that was how things should move. So this is a very painful time for me. I was grateful for the support from Mercer, but I lost a lot during that time. That whole world that I had comfortably occupied and the leadership roles, they all went away overnight. So I kind of licked my wounds for a little bit and tried to make sense of it all. And in 2016, 17, wrote this book called Still Christian, Following Jesus Out of American Evangelicalism. And that was a memoir. I was basically asking this question, had I lost my way, as my critics were saying? Had I walked away from the baptismal promises that I made when I was a 16-year-old at Providence Baptist Church? Or had my journey represented my effort to follow Jesus faithfully? And so there was a lot of spiritual searching that went into the memoir. And I concluded that I did not believe that I had misstepped. I had not lost my way. I had followed just in some unexpected places. In retrospect, I would say that my entire academic journey, I think the Union Seminary, what I consider to be radicalism and liberalism at the time in the 80s, and now I think it was formative for me in ways I was not ready to process at the time. Because Union was about justice and liberation and dignity for those who had been previously marginalized. And a lot of the steps that I've taken in my career that have gotten people mad at me have been about looking for applications of those values, including women in ministry and on race and on torture. Torture was about, hey, we have these people we think are terrorists. We can do anything we want to them. The fact that they were Muslims was part of it as well. And so standing in solidarity with the oppressed, I believe was actually in continuity with the Jesus that I had met as a 16-year-old, even though that is not exactly what I was taught as a 16-year-old. So kind of having done that therapeutic work and that memoir work, thinking that I was done with even thinking about evangelicals, I was ready to move on. I did do some other things, but in my role as American Academy of Religion president in 2017-18, I met a lot of people who were in a increasingly desperate post or confused evangelical or post-evangelical space. I met young scholars, whose pedigrees were impeccably evangelical. Wheaton College, Calvin Seminary, Gordon College, Fuller Seminary, and they were feeling that what was happening with white evangelicalism was appalling, and they didn't know what to make of it. So this helped to trigger my pastoral sense of obligation to try to write, you might say, a post-evangelical theology. And that is what I did, I'd say 2018, 2019, leading to the book After Evangelicalism. So now I believe I truly am done attempting to make sense of evangelicalism. I am a kind of a shepherd now at grandfather age of a lot of young people. I see them in my classes all the time. They know that their faith journey is not going to look like their parents or grandparents, but what it will look like, they're looking for some help, and I think this book maybe helps to provide that. Okay, so that bio stuff on myself went a little bit longer than I thought, so let me just wrap up in this way, and then I want to throw it open. I think that white evangelical Christianity in America has different dimensions to it. It isn't all bad. There have been many, many people brought to faith in that community, many wonderful churches, many profound worship experiences, some fine scholarship, and so on. But in the end, it was an invented semi-fundamentalist offshoot of fundamentalism. It never succeeded in crafting a non-fundamentalist way of looking at the world. And it never succeeded in getting beyond the kind of white, straight male power structure that gave it birth. So some of the blind spots of, you might say, nationalism, patriarchy, homophobia, and just general kind of dominant culture situatedness made it unable to evolve. And when challenged, the impulse of the power structure of evangelicalism has always been to retrench and to silence or exile critics and dissenters. In this sense, those of you who come from a Baptist or Southern Baptist background, the Southern Baptist story that a lot of us lived through in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is one iteration of a broader story. The story of white conservative evangelicalism and fundamentalism squelching and exiling those who wanted more breathing room, who wanted a bigger vision. The political ruthlessness of it has been present from the beginning. The inability to deal with voices from the margins has been present from the beginning. And the people wounded has been present from the beginning. The problem is, what do you do after that? And I think that we need a theologically and ethically robust alternative vision. And that's what I am trying to articulate. There are going to be a lot of different accounts there, but mine is one entry into the conversation. So the new work in the book for me is the methodological theological work. The work on ethics is more of a kind of a building on what I've already done. So the theological work feels a little more experimental for me. But anyway, I look forward to you all engaging it and seeing where we go from there. I want you to know that I feel a great sense of peace about where I have ended up. There was a lot of pain and a lot of anger earlier in the journey, but for now, mainly a sense of gratitude that I've been able to come out on the other side. And I hope that is what will happen for a lot of post-evangelicals. Peace with God, peace in a meaningful Christian community, and peace with the sense that they have a role to play in this suffering world for Jesus. I'll stop there, Ryan, and see where the questions go.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Gushee. I appreciate a great deal, a sense of biography and understanding the place from which someone is writing. Jim McClendon used to talk about biography as theology, and certainly I do believe that. So we give thanks for you giving a sense of flesh and blood and bone to all of this idea as well. So thank you. A question just came in the chat, and it's similar to one I wanted to ask, and it really dovetails with what you were just saying at the tail end. A person is asking about how you've weathered the storms of rejection, and I wish that you might say a little bit more about what has sustained you, both professionally and also as a person.
I'll give you a vignette. In October of 2014, when Changing Our Mind came out, the social media era was far enough along that I experienced what it is like to have the entire hailstorm of social media attack come at you on one day. Jonathan Merritt, the journalist with Religion News Service, did an interview with me. And that interview was kind of what got everybody's attention to the book. That afternoon, I was at the mall with my wife. I must have gotten incoming, it felt like artillery shells from 500 or more people on one afternoon. And hardly anybody is less kind than Christians when they believe that you have betrayed their values or their ideas. And so that was overwhelming. So literally overwhelming. I turned off my phone and I said, I am going to deal with this in a few days. I can't deal with this right now. It's too much. And I know there are a lot of people who've had experiences like that. Gradually I sorted through it, but the Facebook attacks from former friends, the broken friendships, the broken contracts. If some of you know my book, Kingdom Ethics, that I wrote with Glenn Stousen, that book was with InterVarsity Press. We were in the process of writing a revision. That revision was rejected because I was rejected. And so that's why Kingdom Ethics ended up going over to Erdman's, because InterVarsity Press couldn't have me as an author anymore. That's a weird feeling when you've been in a position of hey, will you come speak to us? Will you come write for us? In other words, I had privilege. Those privileges were taken away. One thing that was really important for me is, as I got to know LGBTQ Christians and ex-Christians of various ages, but especially the young, I realized that my new experience of rejection was their daily experience. It had been their experience for their whole lives. And so I felt like I learned some ethics. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about the incomparable experience of seeing from below instead of from above. I was pushed to the margins, and I experienced life along with others at the margins. And I learned some good ethics that way, and it deepened my sense that, those liberation messages that I had heard in seminary and stuff, that they made sense. So at a practical level, I had a church family that supported me so that it didn't cost me my church. And I had a job that supported me so it didn't cost me my job. For a lot of people who make the journey that I've made, they lose their church and their job and their friends and everything else. I at least had some anchor points. I also had the support of my family. So that's partly how I weathered it. Mercer has been great to me this whole time. Bill Underwood, who hired me, has supported me. He said to me one time, "Why, if I didn't have people calling for the ethicist being fired, I would know that you weren't doing anything." So I've always had his support, and that's been wonderful.
An additional question along those same lines, you talk about the trauma for individuals, but I think churches have gone through similar traumas that churches like Broadway, which have been on the same journey that you have been on it as an individual, we've been on as a collective. And I wish you would just talk a little bit about what kinds of traumas you've seen with respect to congregations you know of. And then along those same lines, perhaps you said you were going to say something about the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship known as CBF, and I don't recall that you got back to that.
Okay, yeah. Well, after I published Changing Our Mind, I was invited to speak all over the country. First round of invitations were mainly from churches that had moved towards LGBTQ inclusion. This was fairly early, 2015, 2014. And most of these were traumatized communities. Like they were evangelical, they had 5,000 members. The pastoral team felt led to move in a direction of inclusion, and they had lost, a third or half of their members and 2/3 of their giving, and had been treated like heretics by their former friends, right? That has happened all over the country. It has happened in independent evangelical churches, and those that have been part of networks of evangelical churches, and it has also happened for CBF and Alliance and other kinds of Baptist churches as well. It is, and of course, part of the trauma is it's never unanimous. Inside the church itself, there's always conflict as a change like this is made. And as you move into post-evangelical space, there's always losses. But a lot of times people don't just leave saying, I guess we're not on the same page anymore. They leave angry, and they leave toxic, and they leave attempting to bring the church down. So it's helpful to point out that the post-evangelical trauma is collective and not just individual. And I would say that the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship journey has included some of that trauma. As people who moved SBC to CBF back in the day, where I'm sure often were treated as heretics and as having left the family, never to be welcomed back. And I think that the experience of being beaten around the head and neck repeatedly left its mark with CBF. But I think the main thing I wanted to say in terms of CBF is essentially CBF type Baptists were those, on the whole, not all of them, who saw what this supposedly evangelical project was supposed to look like in Southern Baptist life, and decided that they didn't want any part of it. Or were told, your theology means you don't fit, so you don't get to be a part of it. And so you might say that CBF was already post-evangelical from the beginning. But I've often wondered whether CBF has intentionally fostered the theological reflection that would enable it to define itself in a post-evangelical way. And that's maybe the book can be helpful for the CBF community as it has a chance to maybe do that now at this stage.
Dr. Gushee, a lot of quote unquote moderate churches have felt the pinch in these most recent years. And I'm wondering what you think about that term, quote unquote, moderate. And what is your counsel for churches trying to minister to persons of broad political and theological understandings?
I think the term moderate should be retired. It doesn't inspire. It doesn't describe anything much. It reflects an earlier era when the Southern Baptist side got to claim the term conservative, and the CBF group didn't want to be called liberal, and moderate became the best of a not good set of options. But mainline liberal is not really what most CBF type churches are. They're not radical. They're not liberationists. They're not, on the whole, they're not United Church of Christ. They're not Presbyterian USA. They're something different. I think this post-evangelical term is working for a lot of people, but I don't know exactly what the label will be for churches like Broadway. Certainly, some kind of theological substance that helps people to find a home. One thing I do know, defining ourselves by what we're not doesn't work very well. Even post-evangelical, a problem with the term is it's still post-evangelical, right? It's post something. But when you actually get in the book, there's a theological vision there that I actually call Christian humanist in chapter 4. I think it is, chapter 3. And maybe that term will work for some people. A lot of people have liked, I'm about the kingdom of God. I'm a kingdom ethics, kingdom theology person from the earlier work that Glenn Stassen and I did. So we do need a constructive vision. What was the second half of what you just asked me?
Yeah, also, in addition, the question about your counsel for churches trying to minister to persons of broad theology. Is that even possible right now?
It is very challenging, but I have been increasingly convinced that, and I've written about this in Baptist News Global a couple times in the last year, that our churches, one reason some churches are struggling to not get sucked into the political vortex is because we're not articulating a robust enough biblical and theological vision. And so it's not strong enough to counter the politicized political environment that we're in. And so our people are inclined to think that the pastor is pushing some kind of political agenda because they've been trained to think suspiciously based on whatever TV show that they're watching, right? So our politics has become more like a religion, and our religion has lost the ability to be heard as anything other than a version of our politics. And so that's another reason I tried to write this book, was I want us to still know how to think and speak Christianly from within the terms of the Bible, from outside the terms of American politics of 2020, 2021. To have a robustness in a tradition that goes back beyond this awful time that we find ourselves in, and from beyond the American setting. And so we need the best resources of the Christian tradition from multiple places, and I name a lot of that in the book, and not to get sucked into this odd vortex that we're in right now.
There was another question in the chat box about the term progressive and whether that's helpful.
It depends. A lot of people would put me in the progressive category. Again, progressive is like a spectrum term. There's reactionary, conservative, center right, centrist, center left, progressive. In other words, it's a spectrum. You draw a spectrum from here to here, right? I was asked to speak at for a Zoom event like this for a progressive group, and I think they were surprised at how not progressive my theology actually was from their perspective. I mean, like, I can still affirm the Apostles' Creed. I'm pretty traditional about the Trinity. You know, my ethics on a few points are pretty progressive. My theology is pretty orthodox in my view. Not everybody, I guess, would agree, but I think it is. So, the problem with the word progressive is what people think when they hear that term and who they would associate it with it. Like, I don't know, Bishop Spong, right? Or, you know, Marcus Borg or something. It's like, who are you reading and how are you associating that? I would say, my theology might be described as ecumenical and still little o orthodox within the mainstream of the Orthodox Christian tradition. But I'm reading voices that are not necessarily been in everybody's on everybody's reading list in recent decades.
There was a question in the chat box about Burning Man, and let me just say, if anybody would like to ask Dr. Gushee questions directly, we'll have the opportunity to do that in just a moment with about 10 minutes left. But Dr. Gushee, the question came in about your experience at Burning Man, and which I think you've written about. And
that's not me. I've never been there.
Okay, so
Burning Children. Yeah.
Excuse me, Burning Children. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Hi Lydia.
Sorry about that. Not Burning Man. That's a different.
That's an event. Yeah. In the book.
We would love to see you there too, though.
In the book, I quote aged Jewish scholar named Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who was on my dissertation committee. And here's an example. Holocaust theology is important in my theology. The theology that was written by the Jewish community after the Holocaust. It's a substantial body of literature that I don't think people are reading now. It included voices like Elie Wiesel, but there were a lot of others, Richard Rubenstein, Emil Fackenheim, and then a number of Christian theologians too. But Rabbi Irving Greenberg was not as well known as all of them, but he wrote several essays and one book that I found really, really bracing. And he wrote what became known as the Burning Children test. And this had to do with the fact that children were burned alive at Auschwitz sometimes during the Holocaust. Little kids. When they were at capacity in the gas chamber, sometimes they just killed children in pits. And he said, in light of that, no theological statement should be made that would not be credible in the presence of the burning children.
Okay.
And I put that in the book. And Lydia, I've gotten more feedback on that statement than on almost any other line in the book. But what it says is something like this: Christian theology needs to be responsive to the gravest evils and suffering of this world. A lot of evangelical theology has its formulas that they believe are derived from Scripture, and they do not allow things like the Holocaust to penetrate their formulas. And among those formulas, for many, happens to be a high Calvinist kind of determinism. If it happened, God willed it. If it happened, God willed it is not a statement that coheres with children being burned alive at Auschwitz. So that's an example of, I'm doing serious theology. It's Holocaust-inflected theology, and it shatters any kind of callous determinism in which, if it happens, God wills it.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Gushee. If anyone would like to ask Dr. Gushee a question directly, we'll open the floor up for just a moment. We've got about 10 minutes left. And there are other questions that have also come in the chat. Go ahead, Mark.
Right. Well, I saw another question from my sister-in-law, wanted to know if Dr. Gushee is a Baptist or not.
I am. I am a member currently at Townview Baptist Church in Kennesaw. After many years at First Baptist Church Decatur, I decided to move over partly to help support a church that made headlines this summer, for being kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention for welcoming its first gay members. And one of my proteges is the associate pastor of that church. One of my friends is the pastor. I decided to go over there. So yes, Townview Baptist Church in Kennesaw is where I hold my membership. What's interesting about that church is they never joined CBF. They were Southern Baptist until the Southern Baptist Convention found out that they had welcomed gay people. And then they were kicked out this year. And now they have joined CBF. So that's where I am right now.
Okay, there's a hand up from David and Carol Hafer, although that may be Josh Lucas on the screen.
Hi, yeah, it's me, Josh. Thanks for speaking to us today, Dr. Gushee.
Sure.
First of all, two questions. You mentioned people you were reading. I was just curious to see who you're reading. And then second of all, you'd posted on Facebook, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago about the disparity of like covenantal relationships being the biggest issue of our time, and how we've focused on LGBTQ being like this kind of misdirect. I was just wondering if you could unpack some of that.
Yeah. In the theological part of my book, I mentioned 6 key strands that have affected my theology. So let me give you those. The kingdom of God theology that began to emerge first of all, in biblical studies, but also in 19th century theology. The social gospel around figures like Walter Rauschenbusch. Holocaust theology, which I already mentioned. Liberation theology, like with people like James Cone, Gustavo Gutierrez, have also been more deeply affected by womanist theology and ethics recently, around people like Emily Towns and Katie Cannon. Catholic social teaching of a progressive type, and then the left wing of evangelicalism, which I mentioned, the Anabaptist, Wesleyan, Quaker wing, and then I say, as I look back a little bit further and go into the Reformation period, the Christian humanism of a figure like Erasmus is important to me. So these are, you might say, historical strands of theology that have helped to shape the vision that I have ended up with. On the sexual ethics side, I'm glad you asked that question. I think my sexual ethic is conservative and traditional in the sense that I believe that sexuality needs to be governed by covenant commitment, in which 2 people commit to a lifetime marriage that is faithful, monogamous, and resilient, bearing up difficulties and challenges together, and that is the best context for forming a family and raising children. What makes my ethics so shocking to some people is that I believe that gay and lesbian people should be included in that same framework. And so covenant, the idea that commitments we make have some teeth to them, that we're not allowed to just jump in and out of them casually. This concept really weakened profoundly in the last third of the 20th century and still remains pretty weak. And a great deal of chaos has been unleashed by that. But meanwhile, we want to pick on LGBT people who represent like 2% or 3% of the population because they're different. And sometimes, often, all LGBT people want is to be included in the covenant relationships that they saw that their parents had. They just want to be included in that. And so that's the terms on which I have moved to a full acceptance posture. Not anything goes, but a covenantal vision.
Dr. Gushee, we have about 5 minutes here. Lydia Bean, I think, has a question, as I understand.
Yes, building on that question, David, what would you see as the value or need for drawing boundaries of orthodoxy. I mean, many of us have been on the receiving end of being kind of thrown out of, the Orthodox Christianity, as it were, quote unquote. But, if we're going to be robust and confident in building a new Christianity, I noticed there are several points at which you say, you engage very politely and graciously with more liberal Christians and say, well, no, this is right out, And so, as I wrote a book about Canadian evangelicals in comparison to their United States counterparts, and they're working in a much more post-Christian culture where we can't take for granted the prestige or the authority of Christianity in any way, shape, or form. So, with the understanding that we don't all live in Texas, where for better and for worse, Christianity still has a lot of clout, albeit in ways that aren't always the most positive.
Right.
What would you say is that, what's the role of boundaries theologically or morally, where we say this is Christianity and beyond this, people are misguided and we have to part ways?
That's a great question. I would say every community of any strength has boundaries. It's like a cell, right? A cell has its boundaries. It starts somewhere, it ends somewhere, it's distinct from other cells. Every community has its boundaries. One characteristic of fundamentalism is a tendency to focus on boundaries, evangelicalism too, to focus on boundaries, to seem to take a great deal of glee in enforcing boundaries. I'm not into that at all. I think what I do in the book sometimes, as you've noticed, is differentiate and say, here's my boundary line. Here's why I think it should be here. For example, covenantal, as opposed to some looser understanding, right? So I do think we need boundaries for clarity. I think children need boundaries. Young people need to know kind of what the paradigms are that we think lead to a good life. Churches need some kind of doctrinal parameters, however loose, but some clarity. This is what we believe here. But I think it was Stan Grants, who probably wasn't the first one, but way back, said there are churches that focus on the boundaries and churches that focus on the center, right? What is it that we most surely believe? What is the center of our conviction? I do think that 99% of the time we should focus on what is the center of our conviction. But every so often there comes a time where one has to say, for me at least, or for us at least, here's where the boundary will be drawn. And I think that's been very hard for post-Southern Baptist and post-evangelicals maybe to want to do, because we've been so beaten up by people drawing boundaries and telling us that we're not okay. So certainly not anything that I emphasize, though there, as you know, there are some times where I do differentiate in some ways.
Dr. Gushee, we're wrapping up here. This question probably comes in the context of something that maybe we could talk about the next time. I'll remind everyone that we're going to be back together on October 24th at this same time, 2:00 p.m. Central. But the study of after evangelicalism comes in the midst of really a journey we are on as a congregation, not only following what it is, the trajectory that you have taken, but even more specifically, we're having a lot of conversations around race and LGBTQ in our history as a congregation, with those two not only issues but people, frankly. And we have started something we call ACT, Acknowledge, Confess, and Transform. And it's an attempt to come to terms with where we have been, to recognize our acts of discrimination, whether overt or more implicit, or just simply complicity. I am wondering, as an ethicist, have you given any thought to reparations within a congregational context? Because we have had conversations about that, and that's going to be an ongoing conversation that I know that we are going to have. But a lot of other churches of our similar nature have been having as well. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
First of all, I want to commend you on that journey. It's funny, well, not funny, but when I think about my own like journey on, for example, LGBT inclusion, I mean, the conversation starts off with this kind of, hey, we're the straight people. We know what the rules are. We're in charge. And now we've got these LGBT people and they're challenging us. And then maybe we will like agree to be inclusive, but we're the ones with the power. And we say, okay, now we're going to include you. It's a far further step along the journey to realize, actually, the story here is we held a theology that stripped people of their dignity and hurt them spiritually. And now we are seeking to confess and to repair as part of creating an entirely different kind of community in which everybody here is equal and on equal terms. And nobody is a guest in somebody else's house. We are the house, all of us, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think of colleges that are wrestling with LGBT policies. I think of colleges that are wrestling with their histories in the South, especially of racism and slavery. It's a long way from reluctant concessions to deep repentance and wholehearted desire to do better.
Yeah.
So reparation there, the fundamental meaning at the heart of that is repair.
Yeah.
We want to repair. I think it's more important to repair in the present, to look where relationships are possible now, where harm is currently still being done, though there may be things that can be done to deal with specific harms that have been done in the past. If there were specific individuals who were excluded back in the day, or maybe not so long ago, maybe those specific individuals need to be approached with repentance and with conversations about what does healing look like, but that journey is the right journey, right? And by the way, this takes us beyond moderatism. This is not a moderate journey. This is a radical journey because it goes to the root of a congregation's journey and identity. And it realizes that to truly follow Jesus, we must be radical in naming and owning where we have fallen short of following him properly and in trying to make it right now. So I want to commend that journey. I don't know all the details for you all specifically, but and all this is happening in a context where a lot of people feel challenged. They're just closing down and being brittle and reactive.
Yeah.
To go the other direction towards confession and transformation is the right direction. And I want to commend you on that journey. Not that it's an easy one.
Great. Well, Dr. Gushee, thank you so much. You've given us 13 extra minutes of your time, and we appreciate it so very much. Looking forward to October 24th. When Dr. Gushee is not at Burning Man, he is can be found on the Kingdom Ethics podcast, and I note a little advertisement for that behind you. Is that still going?
Yes, it is. The student I was telling you about is my co-host, Jeremy Hall. We do that. In fact, we had one last week. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I haven't listened to it in several months, but I totally commend that to anyone. You can just search it pretty simply, or Mercer University. Really looking forward to the book study here. If you're interested in the book study, there's links being put in, I think right now, or just a moment ago. If you're interested in signing up, there's still just a few spots open for those. Dr. Gushee, thank you again. I really appreciate this. Looking forward to taking a look at and discussing the book here with as a church, and then coming back and doing a wrap up with you on October 24th. So grace and peace. The world needs your light, and we appreciate you shining it for us and so many, Dr. Gushee. So God bless you.
Thank you, Ryan, and all the best to you all. I look forward to talking with you again in about a month.
Peace.